Welcome back to another episode of Liminal Frames. I'm your host, Nathan, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Darren, ExoAcademian. Darren, it's been, I keep saying this every time we do a show now, it's been a whirlwind couple of weeks. There's so much happening that I kind of can't even keep track of one, how much is actually taking place and when it took place. Some things feel like they took place a week ago and literally they were 2 days ago. So the speed at which things are happening, at least from my perspective, obviously I'm following this super closely. I know you are. It feels incredibly fast. How are you maintaining your calm during this? And do you think it's going to continue at this pace?
Well, one thing I would say is I've pointed this out to a couple people so far. I was remembering when my son was born and the nurse in the hospital kept saying, "Don't forget to make a memory." And it was a great thing for her to say because it really does make you stop, take stock, and really make sure that you're recognizing the small details. You're not getting so caught up in the activity that it's a blur when you look back. So you actually consciously try to ground yourself and say, this is what's happening. This is where I was when such and such happened. And I've tried to take the same approach here. And I think even that's why, as we continue to do these episodes, we should try to drill down to what's been happening in the last week or two since we last did an episode, because one day this will all be behind us. And people will wonder, our kids, our grandchildren, people in the future will be like, what was it like to be alive during those historic moments? And we're living through them right now. So it's something to definitely take stock of.
Yeah, that's a great point, Darren. Important to slow down, take a breath, take stock of what's going on, and make a memory. As you said, I think it's incredibly important. And there are going to be a lot more of these events coming. I think, as you know, the speed at which this is happening will continue. Maybe we'll have some lulls. I have no doubt we probably will. But you can see almost in real time the way the information is spreading through the collective consciousness, initially through the interview that Grush did and the outlets that picked that up. And of course, our community of interest really amplifying that voice. But now recently we've seen updated language that has been proposed in the next NDAA. We've seen, Congress people talking about it in serious tones and in nuanced ways as well. I know we're going to get into some of that. I think I want to start with this proposed legislative language. There's some really good sound bites here from the excellent work that Dean Johnson did in breaking the language about the story here. And so I want to read a couple sections. The first one, and I want to get your take on that. Here he says, the new UAP language would require any person currently or formerly under contract with the federal government that has in their possession material or information provided by or derived from the federal government relating to UAP that formerly or currently is protected by any form of special access or restricted access to notify the director of AARO within 60 days of enactment and to provide within 180 days a comprehensive list of all non-Earth origin or exotic UAP material possessed and to make it available to the AARO director for assessment, analysis, and inspection. A lot of qualifiers in there, Darren. Where do you want to start with that?
Well, first of all, just to listen to those words, listen to the terms in there, and realize that that's actually real legislation. This is not just UFO Twitter banting about ways that it could be potentially, but this is actually the language that's being drafted. It's remarkable, again, even how specific the language is. It's not even as vague as I thought they would try to make it. Clearly, they feel like it's something so clearly non-prosaic that they're going to name it and try to, give a couple different terms to capture it. Of course, you also see with that kind of legal speak there, trying to catch every sort of condition by which a contractor could say, well, that doesn't apply to us really because, and then they make it really clear, restricted, special access, whatever you want to call it, directly or somewhat directly, indirectly, whatever you want to call it. Again, you've got to get back to us kind of thing. And there's a timeline on this, there's this as a period of expiration, you've got to act now. So this is the kind of thing with teeth that we've talked about for a long time in our circles, right? That you can't just say, if it's not too much trouble, would you mind perhaps sending us some information about this such and such? We saw that kind of thing happening early on, kind of sort of playing nice, but we know both the DoD, the secret keepers, the defense contractors who are in league with all of that are not going to offer this stuff up unless they are forced, unless their feet are held to the proverbial fire. That's actually happening now, where there's actually not just strong language, but also timelines given, that you have to do this by this deadline or else, basically. What did you think when you heard that kind of strong language?
A lot of the same points that you just made. I work with attorneys, so I read this and I think, oh yeah, they're covering every conceivable angle that they can possibly think of. Now, what's interesting to me about this as well is that we see a lot of very specific language, and that tells me that whoever wrote this received some of the same kind of specific qualifying language from people who were testifying. Because you could see where they could make a much more generalized statement. And in fact, that's sort of the evolution we're seeing here of the language generally, right? As you just pointed out. Early on, it was a lot simpler, and now it's getting a lot clearer, a lot more specific. And that's what I would expect to see if they have heard from individuals from these programs who have looked at these programs and can tell Congress, these are the kinds of words that you should use to try to capture whatever this might be, because they're aware, they know what sort of wiggle room these the folks that hold this material may try to work with to avoid presenting it, to avoid bringing it forward. So very encouraged by this. Obviously, with any kind of language at all, lawyers are going to kind of piece this apart and try to find a justification for why they didn't do something. But I remember seeing, I think it was Condor Man on Twitter, who basically said something to the effect of, if this is put out there and you have this opportunity and you're a part of these programs, the time to come forward with this is right now. Like, you don't want to be caught later on and have found out that you had the opportunity and you didn't take it. There probably won't be any sort of reconciliation for those individuals then, because they would have had the carrot before. And so that the stick would surely follow if they really didn't comply. And I know you wanted to talk a little bit about the AARO component of this language. That's been a hot topic within the community, the trustworthiness of AARO and Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick. So what is your take there? Do you think that AARO is a reliable partner in this process, or we can continue to see or expect to see some further muddying of the waters, or even potentially some obfuscation?
It's a good question. And just to catch everybody up, there are a couple different issues here. First of all, as Grush testified to basically in that interview with Ross Coulthart, first of all, you have the issue of whether or not AARO is doing its darndest to really get to the truth. But a second question is, do they have access to all of the relevant information to get to that truth, come to the right conclusion about what's really going on, whether or not these programs do exist and whatnot? And according to Grush, they have not had the correct access. So the whole point of this legislation is to open up those avenues so that they would have access. So that takes care of situation number one, but situation number two still exists, which is people question whether or not Sean Kirkpatrick and even Moultrie, who put him in his position, are the kind of people that are trustworthy here. If they have been part of the legacy of the secret keeping, and not even just the secret keeping, but the obfuscation. Again, we think of Luis Elizondo saying that Moultrie was one of the people that prevented him from doing the best he could do in his job. And that's one of the reasons why he sort of resigned in protest. So that's troubling, potentially, for sure. And I would like to see, as we see more strong language come out of different, congressional offices and whatnot, I would like to see real teeth again about what the expectations of AARO are. So it's not just now what should the defense contractors do, what should the secret programs do in terms of bringing information forward and them having a deadline, but it should be made very clear what the obligations of AARO are, of Sean Kirkpatrick are, so that it's clear that these are the expectations and this will be the ruler by which we establish whether or not that's been met. And they need to be clear and concise and as sort of laid out with legal speak as much as that legislation just was, so that there's not really any wiggle room for someone who was trying to obfuscate or not really come to the right conclusion or deliberately steer the process in the wrong direction. And if there's any sense that that is happening, that there is obfuscation, there is not this willingness to really go down whatever avenue is evidentiary, then he needs to be replaced. And I think there needs to be transparency before the public, suggesting that that is one of the things that's being looked at as well, so that each element of this process can be considered, be judged as worthy of a move towards disclosure or not. And we'll see whether or not that actually happens.
Right. And you can imagine, because these Congress people have heard a lot of this testimony, we know it has been given by Grush and by others, that has now been documented. So we know that they have been in receipt of this testimony from various witnesses. So if Kirkpatrick comes forward and doesn't address some of those very specific claims, then I would hope that those representatives would say, well, we heard about this behind closed doors and you didn't say anything about it. So can you tell us anything about that? Why aren't you telling us what you found out about that? Did you look at this at all? And if he doesn't have a response for that, then I think you're absolutely right. We should expect and demand a new representative from that office to really get to the bottom of these issues. It's a very encouraging. It's encouraging to see this language continue to progress along the lines that I think it needs to. It feels almost surreal, quite frankly, when you see the word, non-Earth origin printed in legislative language. That really is jarring when you think about that. So I'm excited about it and look forward to where this is going to go. Obviously, it still has to clear the House, has to get past the president's desk. There are several things that are probably going to change along the way. So I wouldn't wet our expectations too closely to what's been said thus far, but certainly a great start in the right direction. There's another segment from Dean Johnson's piece here that I wanted to read that I thought was really good. I know we wanted to get in some aspect of this. He says, the Intelligence Committee legislation also includes what might be called a safe harbor provision, providing that if such a person complies with the notification and make available deadlines, quote, no criminal or civil action may lie or be maintained in any federal or state court against any person for receiving UAP-related material or information. So this was really interesting. I think being explicitly clear that there's a deadline that will exist, that they expect to receive information. If people come forward with material and information, they will be immune from some degree of federal and state prosecution. I mean, that's a pretty great carrot, I think, to extend, particularly to folks who've been operating in the shadows and may fear that that would be one of the results of them trying to share these secrets. And of course, I can't help here but think as well about the private contractors, right? We've got individuals in these programs, but we also have these organizations. And we've heard a lot of rumors about this. I think it's probably very likely that private contractors are involved because they are so heavily involved with our defense apparatus. You've heard the company Lockheed Martin thrown around quite a bit. So, and I know we had a statement recently as well from their press room that basically said, I appreciate your inquiry into this, but we refer you to the Department of Defense and AARO in terms of what the response would be as to whether we have any of that kind of material. That was a really weird kind of deflection. And I think somebody posted that Spider-Man meme where they're all the Spider-Men are pointing at each other. It's like, no, you talk about it. No, you talk about it. Nobody really wants to talk about it and kind of stick their neck out. But that implies, I think at least subtly, in my opinion, that there is something to talk about. So what's your take on this?
Yeah, absolutely. If there was nothing there, they would just say either no comment or more likely, we have no knowledge of anything of that nature. We have nothing to comment further, something like that. But instead, clearly, they were basically reading a statement crafted by the DOD, it looks like, saying, if you get any inquiries, just refer them to our office, which again suggests that the entire enterprise stretches across from government to contractor kind of actors, and that this is really what's in place. So it just, again, hints more and more that there really is a there. I think your point about the testimony that's already been given before Congress by whistleblowers is well taken, because the reason, and people need to realize this, the reason why this language is as strong as it is, the only reason they would be comfortable being that strong with the language is because they have gone hard at some of these whistleblowers and come away really believing that these people are credible. They know what they're talking about. They're differentiating terms and the nature of the material that's being examined, that kind of thing, to the point where only that, if you think about it, would it make them feel comfortable using this kind of language. I think in some ways it shows how much has been happening behind the scenes. While UFO Twitter has been fretting and wondering, is this really going to happen? I was aware that there was testimony being given by numerous whistleblowers, not just one, and that it was significant information about these crash retrieval programs. Even, mentioning about where they are, perhaps even the bodies, right? What's interesting for those of us in this field is that we've heard all this before. We talked about this, I think, on our last episode, right? It's not like this is all new to us. This is actually confirmation of what's been in the grapevine for a long time. And again, this speaks to how one of the sophisticated strategies that's been used historically with disinformation and obfuscation and whatnot is to leak a little bit of truth in the midst of a bunch of hogwash and hope that people become so exhausted in the process of trying to sort it out that they just give up, or it ends up being, sent into conspiracy theory land. So this is where we are. It's a remarkable time. It really is a remarkable time. I know that later on we want to get into how much is this penetrated, beyond government and UFO Twitter, and not as far as we would like. We would need to get into the mainstream media issue. We need to get into friends and neighbors and family. How much are they being impacted by this? But at least in terms of the language we're hearing coming out of Congress now about hearings and really strongly worded legislation that's meant to get to the bottom, it really gives you the sense that they intend to get to the bottom of this. Now, is this a hot potato that they, as of yet, have no idea how much of a big issue it will be? How much this will be a civilization challenging kind of matter? We think it obviously is and will be. And we can get into even how some of the language even used, again, by these government figures is already, again, hinting at the complexity in terms of the ontology of these beings and whatnot. And that is something I don't think many of us thought would be happening. We thought that might be 2 or 3 years into this process. But already we're seeing people hedging on saying ET. They're saying other things which open up other possibilities in people's minds.
I'm really encouraged by the bipartisan nature of this process and the degree to which, as you well know, the broad public interest in the subject. I think the world has an interest in this, has a vested interest in this topic, even though a lot of folks don't think about it or it's not even on their radar right now. I would wager that when it becomes more real, that everyone will be fascinated by it. And I'm saying this because it is my hope that this particular topic will transcend the kind of internecine tribal issues that we are always bickering over. It's just something has to stop our cycle of tribalism and violence and tit for tat. And what better thing to do that than something that unites us all as one tribe? And I'm just really optimistic here and encouraged that we've got partisan lawmakers who are normally kind of at each other's throats, trying to score political points, both coming forward, backing this legislation, and not just in the Senate, but in the House as well. We've got representatives from both chambers that are really interested in this, and I think unifying in a way that is almost even bizarre. If you were to list some of these partisan names in one sentence and say that these folks agree on this topic, you would almost blow your mind, because they normally are totally opposite ends of the spectrum. So to me, it's all very encouraging and stuff to look forward to as this continues to unfold. One of those politicians, we're actually going to cover a few comments from members, because there were quite a few, even as recent as today. So we're going to cover some of these. I think they're really, really interesting. So first off, I want to start with Marco Rubio. Now, I know folks have been wanting to hear from Marco Rubio since we had the David Grush article and the interviews with him. We were hoping that he would come forward and add some validity to Grush's claims, and we really just recently received exactly that, and not just that, but more than that. So I want to paraphrase here what he said on News Nation. I believe it was yesterday. He said, most of these whistleblowers have held very high clearances and high positions within our government. What incentive would so many people with that kind of qualification, these are serious people, have to come forward and make something up. I thought that was the best comment to hear. You've got direct from the horse's mouth that there's some real weight to this. It's not just Grush. These are serious people with serious backgrounds, and we owe it to them to investigate. So what's your take on that from him?
Yeah, it was an astonishing series of comments he made because from my perspective, this is NLP in action. This is neuro-linguistic programming because without saying it directly, he basically found the back door into your mind to plant the notion there. Because without literally saying it and asking you to grapple with it, he says, well, just think about this, though. In other words, what are the implications of this? And that's something that slowly begins to take seed in your mind and grow, right? Almost like a virus. Because it's one thing to say, yes, there's a there. That would potentially send people into shock and whatnot. Instead, what you say is, add up the math here and ask yourself, what would explain this? So this is what I wrote about this. I said, Rubio said we need to investigate and not jump to conclusions. Fair enough. But he also asked the audience to consider the likelihood that numerous high-ranking, highly cleared, and respected individuals would be coming forward to discuss such matters if they weren't grounded in fact. This is acclimatization kicking into high gear, because that's exactly how I see it. It's acclimatization. It's saying, from his point of view, without saying it, he's implying it seems almost impossible from his perspective that people that are career people, highly regarded, some of the highest clearances, again, people we trust with the greatest secrets of the land, numerous ones of them coming forward to confirm and add to the revelations Grush has brought forward. So suddenly that puts us in very different territory because we knew that initially we'd have to weather the storm and David Grush would have to weather the storm of people going after his credibility. We unfortunately heard recent comments about, because he's autistic, that's maybe what the issue is here and he's being used or something, which is really, really unfortunate. And it just speaks to how low people will go, both to sort of defend the side that they're on and also because people want to defend their worldview and they will come up with any sort of outlandish scheme they can or reasoning to justify why they think the truth that's coming out isn't legitimate. So that was really unfortunate. To his credit, he's been stalwart in his testimony and he's just stuck to it. And now we have secondary and tertiary people coming forward and saying, I also am aware of this. And they're telling other people like Rubio, people who are high up in clearances and are able to hear these kinds of things. So suddenly it doesn't even work to go after just David Grush because now it's been spread, right? The credibility of this goes up 1,000-fold because suddenly you've got numerous people, all with high clearances, high credibility coming forward. Suddenly, if you're to do what we talked about 2 weeks ago, if your argument is that somehow he just wasn't very discerning and he heard someone tell a lie and it got spread up the chain, now you're saying it's infected the entire military establishment. The entire government establishment is this vulnerable to somebody coming up with a tall tale. It's ridiculous. It just doesn't make any sense. I think no matter how skeptical you are, you have to say, sort of like as Ezra Klein has kind of done, which is one of the few journalists on the left that's really taken this seriously. Something is going on. We don't know what it is. He's very cautious to say what it is, which is good, by the way. And again, we can get into the ontology of these beings. But something clearly is in the weeds here. Otherwise, all of this kerfuffle wouldn't be going on. That's what's clear here. And I think, again, this speaks to how we are further along than many people thought we would be. And further along, I think, than I was even thinking we would be. Because, again, the initial hope was this would end up in the Washington Post, the New York Times, NBC News, that kind of thing. That was the original plan. It didn't go to plan, and we still have not seen it being taken up by mainstream media. But clearly, in the inner workings of government, it is working. That the people who are the ones who testify, that have the clearances, that have the information, have passed that on. The second stage that we talked about in our last podcast is happening. Hearings are being organized. There is strong legislation with teeth being drafted. So that's about as much as you could hope for at this point, I think.
The key point here, it's not going away, right? It's not just this flash in the pan story that, it's, sounds really interesting, but he's got no proof and it's just going to fade off into the distance in the next news cycle. It's not going away. We clearly see lawmakers here locked into trying to get to the bottom of this, again, with that bipartisan support. And several of them have said very publicly that they have concerns, that they are treating this very seriously. They have concerns for these whistleblowers because many of the whistleblowers have stated that they have, been received, have received threats, both professionally and even on their own persons, on their families. And so I appreciated that Rubio in particular said that he takes that very seriously and that we're really trying to do the right thing by these individuals. So it's an excellent development here.
Yeah, I just want to add one more piece about Rubio because there's something else I tweeted because, again, he's not really on the side of the aisle that I would usually align with, but I give him credit that he's saying things here that really are groundbreaking. He's leading the way, I would say, in terms of not just speaking to the credibility of this, but he's already working towards how to acclimatize the public, how to slowly inject this venom into the public in such a way that it doesn't cause mass panic. Because this is something else I tweeted today about his comments. I said, this is how you begin to normalize a topic for a mainstream audience. When questioned about whether he found the assertions credible, the senator responded that some of the claims are, quote, are beyond the realm of what any of us has ever dealt with, unquote, but that the inquiry would, quote, intake the information without any prejudgment or jumping to any conclusions in one direction or another, unquote. That's exactly what you want to hear. You want to hear, on the one hand, the acknowledgement that this is groundbreaking stuff. This is civilization-shattering kind of revelations. But we're going to do the slow and steady, methodical, scientific approach. That's what we apply to this. That's what we do with everything else. That's exactly what you want to hear. You want to hear that honesty about these are the revelations, and they're not small. These are earth-shattering revelations. So what we do is we actually investigate, we go wherever the data leads, and we face it head on. We don't try to come to conclusions based on bias or prejudice or what we believed before. We're going to look at what's on the table and come to a conclusion, and that's in the best interest of the country. And I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, that quote is great. And you can see it in their body language. You can see it in their comments that they almost are speaking as if they were one of us. The politicians are very good at using the right language and portraying the right image. They're experts at that. Otherwise, they wouldn't have made it as far as they have. But when you start getting them talking about this in a longer format, you can see that they almost shift into that layman position where they have just as much curiosity and interest in this as the rest of us. They want to know. They are curious, and they are frustrated that we are getting these reports and we're not getting any traction. Again, as coming back to my comment earlier about how this might unite us, you can see how this topic has the power to galvanize the world and really bring us together in a way that we have not been together for a very, very long time, maybe if ever. So it's very, very encouraging. We heard from Senator Warner and Senator Gillibrand as well. Gillibrand saying we're trying to schedule a meeting with David Grush, and then we're also going to try to schedule meetings with the people he mentions in his complaint. She said it's extremely layered because the allegations are very serious. Again, introducing and injecting quite a bit of nuance into this story. And you and I have talked about this a lot, that David Grush to these politicians, they're using really nuanced language. It's not just the boilerplate, this could be ET, space aliens, whatever it is. They're already injecting into the collective consciousness here a complexity to this topic that quite frankly, I'm surprised to see. I didn't expect them to go that far with this type of language this soon. I thought they would really kind of one-dimensionalize this, and clearly they have received enough information from credible people who know about this topic, not just the lore, but know about it firsthand, who've been able to educate through many hours of testimony and conversation these representatives on the complexities of this issue. And that's coming out, it's coming forth in how they are talking about this. So that's another sign to be really encouraged by here.
Absolutely agree. And if you think about it, what's remarkable is it was not that long ago that we were frustrated because we kept having to hear about, well, this could be Chinese drones or Russian drones or Iranian or something, could be some sort of non-state actor, but still human. That wasn't that long ago that it felt like that was always being inputted into the mix. And I remember you and I did episodes early on in the podcast about drones kind of becoming the catch-all for whatever is unusual up in the sky. Well, it's probably just a drone, just like in past other things were swamp gas or whatever, but drones sort of became the catch-all. But we're not hearing that. We're not hearing even these politicians who are so accustomed to always hedging, right? Always hedging. So the fact that they are not hedging whatsoever, they're basically saying in the language, in the statements that are made, in the very legislation, that's what's most revealing here. Things like non-Earth, off-planet, non-prosaic, metamaterial, those kinds of things. It's remarkable. It's just, I want to stop everyone for a moment just to realize how unprecedented this is. This has just never happened before. Never before has there been legislation like this drafted anywhere in the history of modern Western civilization, where you have this kind of legislation speaking to another kind of sophisticated intelligence present with us on the planet and interacting with us in some way. It's remarkable. Your head spins because you sort of want to say, pinch yourself and say, is this really happening? I'm not in a dream. And indeed, we're not. And I wouldn't be surprised if Gillibrand tomorrow mentions the word discombobulating in her comments. She's already said layered, right? And she said serious allegations. So she clearly is taking them seriously. Again, you don't use language like that because the last thing you want to do is overcommit and have to backtrack, right? So you're only going to make these comments if you are 100% clear on the fact that this has been established in fact, basically, because that's what politicians do. As you said, they always very calculated on what they're going to say. They only speak to what they can actually back up when it comes to this kind of thing anyway. We're not talking about electoral cycles and whatnot. So again, remarkable times. And I think we should all take stock and remember where we were today and this week, because we're going to remember this for the rest of our lives.
Yeah. There was a part of me during this recent few days that was kind of flashing back to WMD. Right, you remember, I'm sure, when we heard from our military leaders and intelligence leaders claiming that there was evidence for a WMD in Iraq, and that was the pretense that we used to invade the country and institute regime change there. Later on, we found out that was totally bogus, that intelligence was bogus, and that we basically knew it was bogus, that we were kind of putting forth a lie here. So there's a part of me that, hears a lot of this, and I'm sure there are people out there who feel this way, that they feel that they were burned in that situation, that the intelligence community cannot be trusted in any way, shape, or form. And that's what you're seeing in a lot of the reaction is, oh, these are intelligence people. They're coming forward. It's a multi-layered psyop from within the intelligence community. And what's interesting about that argument is, unlike WMD, where you had the intelligence community very publicly and not in a whistleblower fashion coming forward and actively presenting intelligence to substantiate WMD, you're not having that at all. In fact, Mike Gallagher today on the Pat McAfee show specifically mentioned that he had 5 requests outstanding with the intelligence community that he's still waiting on. He's incredibly frustrated. They are essentially kind of stonewalling or dragging their feet in getting him information. And this is a guy who used to be in the community itself. So you can feel his frustration at the pace, the slow pace that he's getting information. He and his fellow representatives are getting this information. And that's why I think this is something entirely different than just a orchestrated, sort of higher intelligence community operation against our politicians and against the American public. Now, I would also remind folks that with WMD, the politicians who were in charge were also highly aligned with that line of reasoning to go into Iraq. So we don't have that here. We don't have that same set of circumstances. But I don't know if that's ever crossed your mind, or I know you've seen that as an argument out in the community from folks who really have a hard time swallowing this. And of course, that goes back as well to the long history of government obfuscation and misdirection in this topic that really has done so much damage in our ability to get to the truth here.
Absolutely. I think one thing we all have to keep in mind, and I know that it's a major focus of an issue we cover on Liminal Frames, is the psychological and sociological angle. Because this is not just about revelations and they're true or not. It's also about how we metabolize information, the degree to which we trust different authority groups. And like you say, history plays a large role there. So I think when you see some people, and I've been surprised by some people that I know even, who immediately leapt to Grush as part of a massive psyop, then they sort of like slotted in with the Stephen Greer, this is meant to make us nervous about aliens so we can weaponize the military to defend us against these bad aliens, and it's all part of the psyop for increased military funding. But I think what goes on there is partly this psychological defense mechanism, right? I really want to make people aware of this. And I know we want to get in later into how this gets acclimatized by believers, skeptics, debunkers, everybody, right? How do we move forward once we cross the Rubicon, right? But I think this expression comes to mind here. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. So people have seen many times that the government has obfuscated, has disinformed and misinformed the public, has deliberately passed out false information. We think about what happened to Linda Moulton Howe. She got led down an avenue that ended up being completely false, which just brings all sorts of lack of credibility to the entire ufology community and also makes us look more and more like tinfoil hat kind of kooks. So knowing this has been the historical precedence, people are understandably very wary of believing this. Why should I believe you now? But again, I think this is where you and I would make the point that government is a very complex, multifaceted group of organizations. And it's not as simple as the government either tells me the truth or they lie to me. Of course, they do both all the time and a million different iterations of gray area in between the two. What we have to reckon with here is that some of the calculus is changing, that it's partly because there's been increased activity by some of these non-human groups or non-conventionally human groups, I want to add. It's partly that. It's partly because some of the secret keepers themselves, after generations, have said, we need to get this out. They want it off their conscience. Even Grush talked about that, being tens or hundreds of people on the inside that recognize this is in the public interest. It doesn't violate national security to bring some of this forward. That's kind of an old argument. We're not in the Cold War anymore. Even if we do still have, international adversaries and whatnot, this can be brought forward. It's more important that the public can metabolize this and begin to metabolize what is a real aspect of our reality rather than burying this again. So these are things to keep in mind, that whenever you see these things rolling out, don't just ask yourself, is it true or not? But ask yourself, what are the psychological implications behind why someone takes this seriously or not? And what are the sociological implications of this as it begins to metabolize into our culture? Because those are in some ways more important than the information itself, because at the end of the day, it's how that stuff becomes metabolized, how it begins to change culture, change people's behavior ultimately. The degree to which that happens is what this will ultimately be measured by.
Right. And the nearness, the proximity of this issue to our moment, right? I think a lot of the folks in the world understand that we're probably not alone in the universe, that it's a reality. There is other life out there. There's very likely other intelligent life, and there's intelligent life that's more intelligent than us. But they will say, it's really far away, right? So it's really far away. And because it's so far away, I don't really have to worry about it. I don't have to really process that or sit with the implications of that in our world, in my day-to-day, in my reality. But it's the proximity of this truth can't get any closer. And that is catalyzing this, sort of crisis of understanding, crisis of knowing. There's a lot that we're going to have to wrestle with as a people that we have really not wrestled with at all, ever in a long time. We're kind of really poor at dealing with these questions. We're not great at nuance, as you know, but we have seen in a lot of the statements so far, as we talked about earlier, a good deal of nuance being introduced into the lexicon about this subject from the folks who are leading these investigations. Gallagher, again, coming back to him today, said, Perhaps this is an ancient civilization that has been present on the earth the whole time, and now they're making themselves known. I mean, wow. I mean, that's a theory I wouldn't have expected to hear from a representative. And he mentioned as well that the last time he was on that show, he put forth the other top hypotheses about what this could be, including the extraterrestrial, the time traveling human component. So again, introducing these ideas into our conscious awareness really is important. It's incredibly important, because we cannot just approach this from that one-dimensional Hollywood sci-fi perspective. It's not going to get us anywhere, and we're going to have to start doing the hard work of getting our minds engaged with the true complexity of what this is, and really exercising a part of ourselves that we, for the last many decades, have kind of allowed to atrophy, right? I talked about before the show that, think about our kids. I mean, we talk about what field should our children go into when they go to university. We don't talk about the humanities. We don't talk about sociology or philosophy. We talk about STEM fields. Go into the STEM fields because the technology is going to make you money. And so what do we see in our world? We see a lot of technology. We see a lot of adoption of technology, a lot of fascination, addiction to technology. But we are impoverished when it comes to understanding who we are and wrestling with those deeper questions. And this is a juncture where we, I think, must come face to face with that truth and begin going the other way, if we don't, to our own detriment.
It's absolutely true. And we probably have never been less prepared for these kinds of nuanced conversations based on the way that our culture has proceeded. I mean, just to be clear, these politicians would not be introducing these notions in terms of the ontology of these beings unless they had already decided, probably in some deep conversations around tables in hushed tones with nervous laughter to some degree, probably, they've recognized that something is here that doesn't fit with any of our pre-existing models, doesn't fit with expectation, doesn't fit with, like you said, Hollywood tradition. And we have to get out ahead of this. We have to start seeding the public with possibilities just to begin to get those gears moving in people's minds that have long atrophied, like you say. People need to start thinking about other possibilities. Of course, Mike Masters and the extraterrestrial hypothesis is one. Grush talked about interdimensional, and his background in physics led him to speak about that. These are things that, again, we've talked about many times in this community, but for the average person and the average politician and the average media person, this is going to be completely new, foreign, right? So this, again, it speaks to the moment we are in. I just want to make this really clear again. Politicians don't see any more than they ever have to. So it's only after a really clear, cogent conversation amongst themselves that they would have come to this conclusion that we need to start seeding the public with these notions, because it's only going to get more difficult to metabolize from here. We have to get out ahead of this narrative, which is remarkable. And from my point of view, what I keep getting in terms of the way that I sort of try to make sense of what this is and some of the sort of messaging I receive, I get the sense that, again, our models are still so insufficient that we can't really come up with something that's even close to the truth. And it occurred to me the challenge we have is we only ever are able to estimate how much we know based on what we knew before. We have no idea what's out ahead of us. We have no idea about what we don't know that we don't know. We have no idea how much of a microcosm our current model of reality might be. And it might work within a certain framework. It might be productive enough to transform our civilization the way our technological understanding has. But as we've talked about in earlier episodes, modeling nature, understanding how nature behaves, does not mean you actually understand what underlies nature. We don't know even about the basic structure of reality. And because we don't know that, we don't know in what way these beings are coming in. They clearly, if nothing else, are able to manipulate and work with space-time in a way that completely confounds us. We leap to, are they time travelers? And they might very well be, or that might be one component of it. But again, the challenge here, as I've been saying on recent episodes on liminal frames and on point of convergence, the questions physicists are asking are about the nature of reality beyond space-time. So to even begin to try to land these beings, the ontology of them, within our model of space-time, no matter how outlandish or exciting or next generation the model is, if it's still based in space-time and space-time is ultimately illusory and not foundational, then we're still kind of barking up the wrong tree. So that speaks to how far we have to go here and how potentially, it had to happen, discombobulating this will be for our society. Because it's one thing to say, I need to sit you down and tell you about some beings that are here, and this is their origin. That's freaky, isn't it? No, the conversation is there's some beings, they're here. They perhaps always been here. They run circles around us. They can move through space-time like we move through open doors. And we have no idea who or what they are ultimately. And that speaks to the poverty of our understanding of the nature of reality. That's basically what disclosure is here. And that's just part of it, because I think there's even other origin sources and other kinds of beings. We're just talking about a certain kind that has been very instrumental in interacting with us over the last few decades and bringing forward these messages about impending doom and apocalypse and cataclysm if we continue with our ways. And we seem to be very eager to continue in our ways. We don't seem to be changing much at all. So this is where we are. This is what we face as a civilization.
Profound. It activates our fight or flight instinct. Being the apex predator for so long now, we've not necessarily had to worry about that. We've not had to worry about a mystery creature entering our reality and taking one of our family members and killing them. So this is akin to that sort of surprise element in our world that we can't plan for, we can't control for. It can just happen. And so as a result, we're going to go into our defensive, reflexive sort of mode there. And you can only imagine how we will attempt to grapple with what this means. And I think we've got a lot of hard work to do there. I'm not sure that we are ready in our current state to do that type of work without assistance or without leadership. So I really am hoping that the individuals who are closest to this, that have been closest to the secrets and who are examining this now, are beginning to do some of that work. We obviously have just given several examples of signs where it seems as if the work is being done, that they are starting to do some of that work. And it's important that they do that. We need our leadership to be able to talk about this in a nuanced, clear, cogent way so that we can absorb it. We can absorb it without a lot of friction. And again, I'm really pleased that we're not hearing from the executive branch, right? It's not, you don't hear the Biden administration really leading the charge here. They basically, he came out to that podium in February and said, well, I'm starting my own group or whatever. We've heard absolutely zero about that group. It may not even exist. And no further statements about it. We continue to hear, though, from Congress. And those are our representatives from all across our country, from all across the political divide. And really think about it like that's where it should happen. It should happen within the House, right? Within the House, at that table, amongst all of the people who are closest to their families and their communities. We need that kind of conversation to take place before it percolates up to the executive level. And let's be clear, too, if it came out of the executive, how many people in the country would just be like, I don't even want to listen to this. It's absolutely bogus, right? So it can't come from them. I mean, really, I guess what I'm getting at here is we're seeing so many signs right now that this is, one, taking place, and two, it's unfolding in a way that feels, to some degree, responsible. It feels like it is a smart way to go about it. Is it as fast as we might like it? No. Those of us who've been really into this for so long, and those of us who've passed away, who've never seen this moment come to fruition, obviously, let's not forget all of those folks that we stand on their shoulders in this moment. It's not happening at that kind of speed, but it's happening at the speed at which our culture can acquire this information, can metabolize it, and can work it into our collective conscious, and then will spark a whole new host of questions and avenues and pursuits that I would only hope would be done at an even larger level, right? So this conversation's happening actively in the United States, but we want to see it transcend that, right? It has to. it's got to transcend the U.S. It's got to get into the global community. We've heard that Project Titan is kind of making progress there and could get introduced in the UN. It really has to reach that kind of level. Can we transcend our conflicts, though? Because there's so many of those happening right now that seem to consume all of the airtime.
Yeah, and to your point there, we are seeing movement within the other Five Eyes countries. We are seeing a lot of comments coming out of Canada, which I've commented before. I kind of was aware of some of that going on. Just to make people aware here, there is communication between the different governments, and especially with allies, close allies like that, with the Five Eyes. And so there was some coordination that happened in terms of there was this awareness that the summer of 23 was going to involve some major revelations. And so there was prepping of these different countries that each could sort of determine how they were going to first brief their parliaments and whatnot, and then eventually brief their populations. So this, again, speaks to how unprecedented this is, that this is a global situation, and the preparation has been global, which is remarkable. And again, at any time, we might see some of these other countries leapfrog us in terms of coming forward. We think about, again, Brazil, how much information they're sitting on. France has been a leader in the past. They could come forward. Australia, Canada, whatnot, could also. We are seeing more upfront commentary from MPs like Larry Maguire in Canada than we're seeing from pretty much any other political office around the world. And at some point, again, we cross some sort of threshold where suddenly MPs across the world, Congress people across our country, recognize that a line has been crossed and history is being made, and you want to be looked at as one of the people who was on the right side of history, and you were on the front foot, not responding or reacting at the last minute. And when that happens, we're going to see a stampede, I would think. And when you think about how much has already been seeded into the process in terms of the legislation that's being written, the comments that are being made, it makes you realize we're further along than many people realize. We haven't seen all the dominoes drop in terms of what is visible on a public level, but in terms of what's happening in the machinations of government and whatnot, that is already in play. And so I think we can expect much more to happen. And even the last few days for me have been encouraging in terms of initially some of these senators and representatives we were not hearing from, and I was wondering why. Clearly, they were spending some time in deep introspection with their aides and whatnot, trying to determine what's the right way to say this. I guarantee you, Marco Rubio did not go, off the cuff, I'm just going to say something here. No, he spent days thinking about, how am I going to say this? What exact words am I going to use? How can I say just enough to seed this into the public conversation, but not so much that I cause mass panic or get myself into a position I don't want to be backed into? This is what's happening now, and we're going to see dominoes drop because of these initial steps.
Exciting times. We've heard the phrase ontological shock, and we touched on this a little bit a few minutes ago, but I want to spend a little more time with it before we move to our last segment of the show. We talk about that very often in personal terms. I've gone through that in my own life. I know you have as well, where your worldview, the way that you understand reality, is challenged and changed. And when you feel that deep inside of your bones, it changes who you are. You can literally almost look back to that moment and say, I was a different person before this happened and after. And it colors the world that you then move into. I'm thinking here of The Wizard of Oz, right? The movie starts out in black and white, and then she gets to Oz and it's in color, vibrant color. It's a totally different world, and there are new rules. There are new strange oddities that you have to navigate. And there are encounters that happen, there are experiences that happen that you have to make sense of in frameworks that you, quite frankly, have no grounding in, right? You have no experience in. So what do? You rely on those people who you meet along the way, who help you navigate that process, navigate it all the way to the Emerald Castle in this instance, right? And we can talk about that as well. But, what do we think about this from a societal perspective? Has society ever gone through a similar kind of ontological shock or struggle that you can think of? I have a hard time kind of thinking about that in terms of history, and I admittedly am not a history buff, But when I do think about World War II, for example, and the Holocaust, all the horrors that happened at that time, where after the war, the world really wrestled with the atrocities and the violence that occurred during those two huge conflicts. And there are a lot of pacts made and intentions articulated to try to avoid that happening ever again, because so many millions and millions of people gave their lives. So that was a literal kind of before and after moment in our human history. This will be another one. And how do you anticipate the world navigating that ontological shock as we go through that collectively?
That is the $10 million question, because we don't know on what kind of time frame that will roll out. We don't know if this is going to be seeded into our population, but it might take 5 years, 10 years to fully metabolize, or will events roll out in such a way that because of some sort of emergent cataclysm, or because the beings themselves up the ante in terms of their interaction with us, people have to make that shift within a year or two. It's hard to know how it's going to roll out. But I love your analogy of the Wizard of Oz and the black and white to color. That's a perfect example of what we're talking about here, because imagine you live in a world of black and white, not just in terms of what you see on TV, but imagine if your world was literally black and white. And people said, you have to prepare yourself for a different kind of dimensionality. And you're like, what do you mean? Like, you're going to build onto the house? What are you going to say? I mean, you're going to think in terms of the spatial and representative understanding of reality you have. You can't say to someone who has never seen color, well, what I want to prepare you for is a world of color. They don't know what that means. They have no way to go there. It's that different, right? It's a dimensional shift to the point where there is no corollary prior to it happening. And I remember, speaking of history, seeing how there were some television shows who actually literally shifted to color, like Technicolor color, in the middle of an episode, which must have been so amazing to experience that. Our relatives, a couple generations back, to be sitting there and suddenly see what has always been black and white go to color. But again, imagine that your world, your actual reality was black and white, and you suddenly had to grapple with it being full of color. Because that is not too far off here, because we think of them moving through time as that being sort of the fourth dimension in our sort of 3D plus one mentality and perceptual set. But at higher developmental and dimensional levels, suddenly time might just be rolled into another kind of dimensional framework where you can move through time like we move through space. And that might be exactly what they're doing. And even that is just a theoretical construct that might be a far ways off. I mean, again, this speaks to how much we don't know about what we don't know. How this gets metabolized is going to be very, very tricky. We've never been here before, to answer your question. You think about World War II. Yes, those were morally bankrupt days that we really had to step back and say, we thought we were a civilization that had made all this progress, and we had let technology transform us, and we had raised ourselves out of poverty and agrarian cultures, and now we suddenly had the advances of all the modern world, and yet we went and had the most atrocious war ever, and more people were killed within a few years than it had ever been killed in the history of the world because of things like atomic weapons coming on the scene after that and whatnot. So suddenly our lack of consciousness development becomes all the more prominent in our awareness, because our ability to kill ourselves is so much more deadly and sophisticated than it had ever been before. But in terms of really reckoning with what we're talking about here, other than shamanic and indigenous cultures who've already had this as part of their worldview, ever since sort of the Renaissance, any kind of like understanding about living in a world that's governed by the laws of science, and we can make predictions, and everything is safe and fun and ours for the taking, right? Again, the assumption there, the unspoken assumption, is that we are the apex intelligence. This is the playground, and you get to play with it however you want, and you are the top dog. Suddenly we find out that there is another top dog that is so much beyond us, in fact, that has been able to run circles around us, perhaps for our entire civilization's history, and perhaps even is responsible for much of that history and the way things have rolled out in terms of a control mechanism and whatnot. How can we compare this to anything else in history? It's never happened. This is the biggest revelation, the biggest issue that our species has ever had to grapple with on the level that we're doing it now. at a time where so much is going on in terms of we feel like we're on the verge of civilization collapse and climate collapse, and the fact that so much of the messaging, again, from these beings and their activity here has been around those very issues and their warnings about them. And all this is happening at the same time. Again, what a time to be alive. On the one hand, it's exhilarating. On the other hand, it's quite overwhelming.
Yeah, I would look to our art, our culture, to help us with some of these challenges. Art, as you know, has been an excellent medium for humans to express the wide gamut of emotions and experiences that we have. And so I have no doubt that our artists will produce content that will help us connect with the complexities of these realities and navigate them. Also, of course, we have AI coming on board. We've talked about that a good bit as well, and how it itself is a kind of alien technology to us. So there is a bit of a approximate analog there that we can interact with that may help us navigate some of the strangeness that could come about from understanding how this really works. And I think at the core of it all, though, is relationship. Human beings, just as we talked about with the Wizard of Oz analogy, we navigate our hardest challenges together. We find those who are in the trenches with us, and we work together to try to get out of those situations, and we rely on one another. And we've really entered into a time where relying on one another is almost looked at as a weakness, where our radical individualism and our need to score points in an argument has sort of superseded any other thing that is important in life, that we've mistaken those goals for what is truly essential. And so I believe that we need to reclaim our ability to relate with each other in a deep, meaningful, intimate way. We need to be vulnerable with each other and be honest about how difficult this will be, because we're not going to get through it kind of just winging it, or trying to act tough, or trying to score points. We're not going to navigate this in that way. And so, I'm saying that, and you and I have talked about this, this is important to me, because as this becomes more and more real, we are going to have communities and the pockets within our own community who have been constantly fighting each other, or we're going to have to really sit down and be serious, be adults, and get past some of these differences that we've had, where we've tried to sort of beat our opposition into a pulp. And we have to kind of resist the temptation to take a victory lap. And we need to lean in to those spaces where there has been so much damage and brokenness, and repair that. We have to. We cannot get through this on our own, and we need the folks who have been skeptical. We need the folks even who have been debunkers. We need all of their mind. We need all of their selves to get through this, because they will add to our understanding of what is going on. Absolutely essential.
It's very true. I think we will have a lot of pressing questions to answer about how we respond in this moment. And the status quo will not get us through this, will not serve us well. And again, as I've said before, this may be the shakeup we need to perhaps make us rethink fundamentally how we interact with each other. I know I've said to you, and I've said to others as well, that I sense that the change that needs to happen is a civilization-wide change. We need to get beyond a capitalist model. We need to get beyond a commodity-focused relationship with the earth. We need to also, in addition to systemic changes, we need to change how we interpersonally interact with each other and begin to relearn some of the things that we took on as kids in terms of being forced into a certain kind of mode of being, and stripped some of our innate capabilities that we see on display with some people having interactions with these beings with telepathy and this kind of psychic connection. I think those kind of things are available to us if we will really take the time to rethink not just how we form our systems, but also how we interrelate with each other. These are the questions on the table. And if there's ever an issue that could prompt us to go deep enough to really change something at that level, both interpersonally and systemically, this is it. You think about, again, Reagan and Gorbachev having conversations about this, apparently. I've heard ruminations about Kennedy and Khrushchev having these conversations, that this has been in the mix for people deep in the know for a long, long time. Now it seems like it's reaching the level of the public conversation. So we'll see what happens. Again, I would hope that as much as this is civilization challenging, and it is overwhelming to the nth degree, that's exactly the kind of thing we do need to wake us up. And it might not even wake us up. It might not work, but we need to be woken up. So I'm optimistic, at least about that this gives us the opportunity, impetus to perhaps wake up if we choose that path.
Yeah, and I think on that note, we'll turn the last part of the show here to a really powerful piece that was written in the Huffington Post by David Riddell about his father. And his father was a rancher in Wyoming who was a famous, alien abductee or had encounters with UFOs. And nobody took him seriously. And it totally impacted his life. It impacted his family, his community. He was homeless at one point because of the sort of consequences of his fixation on these UFOs. And the article is just so powerful as the son is wrestling with the past, where he skipped his own father's deathbed because he had made his mind up long before that his father was not a serious person and he didn't need to be there at that moment. And the grief that you hear from this writer at that lost opportunity, right? And how many folks have you and I met and know who have had these experiences, who have tried their best to cope with them, who have tried to come forward and share those intimate details and look for answers. And the answers aren't there. They don't find them. What do they find? They find ridicule, and they find mockery, derision. Imagine dealing with that and the shame and not fitting in the culture and navigating that world. So we have a lot of work to do with each other in redeeming these people, and I would argue a lot of people who have had these experiences, more than we think. So we have a lot of hard work to do there in wrestling with the way this has impacted us at the deepest level.
Indeed. And just to give people background who are not familiar with that article, basically this person wrote an opinion piece based on their own experience. And it was published in the Huffington Post. And they spoke to the fact that it was after the gross revelations came out. This is one of the dominoes to drop. And this is just one example of many, many, many that are probably playing out as we speak, of people suddenly reflecting about their family members, their friends, people they knew who reported these kinds of experiences 10, 20, 30 years ago or beyond, and were left with scoff and skepticism and accusations of insanity or outright fraud, right? These are kind of the responses that people had. And you think about when you're in school and all the kids think one thing's cool. And if you're a kid and all the kids think something's cool that you want to go a different way, you feel this immense pressure to go with the in crowd, right? To conform. And this is what happened here, right? We have all of the authorities in our society saying this cannot be. This simply cannot be. There's no need to even reckon with it because we know already that that is not reality. Therefore, there must be another answer. Again, I often give this example when John Mack had to go before a board at Harvard to defend his actions and even investigating, even daring to investigate the UFO phenomenon and the abduction phenomenon. Afterwards, one of the people came up to him and said, John, if you had just established a new kind of psychopathology, we would have patted you on the back and said, no problem. Instead, you asked us to question the very nature of reality. But that's what's in play here. That's the issue. And what kind of hubris do we operate under to think that we don't have to ask those questions, or at least be open to asking those kinds of questions? It's just unfathomable and preposterous, really. But in this article, you can hear the grief because this is not something you get to do over. Now, I would argue perhaps they will meet again. Again, I think that this body-mind, this iteration is not all there is. That's another one of the things that our society needs to reckon with. And how much better would we be once we do reckon with that this is not all there is? How would we make decisions differently, both individually and collectively, if that was well understood? But in the meantime, until we get there, he has to grapple with the fact that his dad died alone, being rejected by his family and his community for basically telling the truth. And that now revelations are coming out that basically establish this as within the realm, not just credibility, but likelihood suddenly. And again, these are things that have been part of the subculture for a long time. Cattle mutilation, alien abduction, it's all connected. And not only that, but actual comments about this sense of, quote, a coming climate apocalypse, unquote. How many times have we heard that? How many times have I mentioned this on our podcast? This is the standard messaging. This is the same message the kids at the Ariel School in Zimbabwe received as well. I recently was reading comments by one of the girls who was one of the few to stay there. Well, a lot of those kids ended up going back to Europe or Canada, wherever they came from, right? But this one girl said, damn it if the beings weren't right, because we've clear-cutted the forest right around here. We've done the very things they were warning that we were going to do. So you and I were talking about this before we went on the air. This is not just prognostications from our linear point in time. These are beings that can move through time. They've said, we know where you're going. It is not good. It will result in disaster. Try not to be too much of a downer here for everybody, but I'm just saying this has been the consistent messaging. And when you look at what we're facing right now in terms of what's changing in the world, it looks like it's a prophecy coming true. And yet we still are not really grappling with it. We're still burying our heads in the sand, trying to pretend what's happening all around us is not happening, or try to explain it away as something else. This is the challenge we face. And again, a story like this really helps to bring it home to a human level, a father and his son, and how they were divided over this issue and the regret he feels. And I think a lot of us need to think about not just how he feels, but how we respond to people. Because one of the things that John Mack also recognized, he was asked about this one time, is that he believes, based on what he was seeing evidentiary data to support, was that a lot of people seem to be able to access other elements of reality, a broader reality beyond what our consensus narrative has allowed for. And we have put many of these people in asylums. We put them on medication. We've assumed that they are operating outside conventional consensus reality. And yet they probably were tuning into something. I'm not saying it's simple. I'm not saying that there aren't people who suffer from mental illness, but I'm saying that because, again, we don't know what we don't know, I agree with John that we have psychopathologized some people when we shouldn't have, because they dared to. What did they do? All they were guilty of was being aware of other aspects of reality that most people are often not. So again, all of that comes into play here as well in terms of, as we grapple with this, if it is multidimensional, if it is in some way like that, and that some people can either in certain states of consciousness or perhaps all the time actually perceive these other elements of reality, or realities, plural, and that makes it difficult for them to operate as a functioning, productive member of our society, gets up 9 to 5, goes to a job, blah, blah, because they are having to grapple with these simultaneously arising realities. This is perhaps part of what's really in play here. I think it is what's really in play here, which just speaks to how much of this is a human story about how we treat each other and how we handle anomalous information.
Yeah, this is a topic that is really important to me. I care about people. I care about people that I don't even agree with. And, this speaks to how do we treat otherness? That's what we're talking about, otherness here. And our instinctual reaction to otherness is really typically, arm's length, to an extreme. It can be violence, to not allow otherness to penetrate our reality. And what we're asking for here is really the opposite of that, to engage otherness with understanding. And that's a really difficult task. We don't have the tools. We live in an impoverished time. We've talked about this, the crisis of meaning. that everyone is experiencing kind of the post-truth world. We are fixated on the wrong kinds of things. We are really in a sort of spiral here, a death spiral, both intellectually and I think socially and globally when it comes to where we are with the planet at the moment as well. The things we have done before aren't going to serve us well going forward. To continue to do them is its own kind of madness and folly. I'm also reminded, with this piece, and you touched on it, and I know when we met on Sunday this week in person, it was probably the darkest, I think, encounter that you and I have shared together, just in terms of the entire conversation was really very gloomy and down. And, and I told you that, if I were to title this episode, I wanted to title it, "It's the End of the World as We Know It." It feels very dark, but I'm reminded that there are so many stories in our human history where we speak of these things. We speak of endings. We speak of catastrophes, of apocalypse. This is a part of the fabric of our story. And you and I both know we were taught to look at those stories allegorically, to look at them through the framework of entirely a metaphorical situation that helped explain maybe political conflicts of the day, or were used as a rhetorical device to convince the listener, the audience, to be persuaded by the author's point of view. Really kind of just neatly sweeping them away as nothing to worry about here. Everything's fine. And I think we have to start doing some serious work about confronting endings. And I don't even mean we have to go to the point of catastrophes. I think we have to do better work at confronting our own end. How much time do we really spend on thinking about our mortality and what that means, and how that changes how we live in this moment? Now, you hear so many folks who are at that point in their life, they're near that end, they're in that last chapter, and they want more time. They just want to do things a little differently. They wish they could. They wish they could spend more time with their family, their loved ones, not focused on getting things, accumulating things. Well, there's nothing stopping us from examining that, having that thought exercise, and changing how we behave, how we interact, how we treat each other. So I'm a proponent that we need to take this as an opportunity to really re-examine everything that we have come to prize in our society, and dismantle that and start again with something new. That we can do that. Even in the face of catastrophe, we can still do that, and it still means something.
The cautionary tale is be careful what you wish for, because sometimes the thing you wish for is least likely to wake you up. And waking up might be the main purpose of the exercise. So our entire society is structured in such a way as to make ourselves comfortable, entertained. For what reason? So we can spend a few decades doing that and then we move on? Is that the purpose? Is that really the depth of what we want to grapple with here? Whereas I would say that this is actually a stage for the evolution of consciousness, that the physicality of it is just part of the perceptual set that is meant to make us feel like we have skin in the game, that we've forgotten to some degree that we are source, that we are connected to each other, that we are eternal. But we forget, because that is part of the process, to actually feel the resistance training we have to come up against when we do grapple with difficulties in life and actually rise above them. But staying comfortable and entertained is not the end goal. So sometimes wrestling with the end of the world, whether it's for us personally or for all of us, can be the very thing that helps wake us up. And if this is not all there is, and I'm confident, very confident it is not, then in some ways you could say it's one of the greatest gifts you could ever experience. This is sort of what's on the table here. I was thinking also about how each of us has to reckon with, so this guy wishes he had treated his father differently. One thing I was sharing with you before we went on the air was, one time I was in a church, a long time ago, and it was a pretty conservative church at the time. And one of the elders got up and was giving his testimony. And he happened to be a 747 pilot. He would fly to Japan once a week, I think it was. And in the middle of his testimony, which as you and I both know from in those circles, you don't generally hear about UFOs in those kinds of testimonies. It's usually about what God's done in your life and how thankful you are. And yet in the midst of this testimony, he suddenly mentioned being a 747 pilot, and one time a giant mothership craft pulled up right next to the cockpit, and he could see beings looking through portholes at him that looked like prototypical grays. So I'm sitting in the audience in this congregation going, what now? What did he just say? Because this was before I had a huge interest in this topic. I was not taken with it as much as I am now. But even then, I felt the very thing that I'm talking about here. I was guilty of the very thing I've mentioned here in the terms of I wasn't sure how to touch base with him on that topic. And so basically what happened was no one asked him. So afterwards, people were like, hey, great testimony, brother. Thanks for sharing your story. But no one said, what was the deal with that UFO? Like, what happened? What did you feel? Nobody asked those questions. I didn't ask those questions. In retrospect, I wish I would have. That's an amazing historical event. And how many times do you come across someone like that who's had that kind of experience as a captain of a 747 flying over the Pacific when that happens? So that's an example of all of us probably have had those kind of things happen. Maybe it's in mental health issues. You've run into someone who maybe was tuning into something more than just them being quote unquote insane, but they actually were grappling with the ungrounded nature of having to make sense of realities that are interspersing with each other, interpenetrating. This is what's on the table here. Again, it can at the same time, I think, broaden our scope about what reality actually is. And maybe also, as this notion of a cataclysm begins to dawn, also make us think about what really matters, what life is. What is this, right? Using kind of a Buddhist question. What is this? Why am I here? Where is it all going? And how might the very things that we're most afraid of actually potentially catapult us into real realization that is the most important in terms of what we take with us?
What can we do, right? What are the things we can begin doing, putting into practice? I know you're really focused on this, that you're working on curriculum that would help facilitate the kind of change that you are proposing. I certainly would say, be more present, pay attention to what you are paying attention to. Think about your likes. What are you liking? Are you elevating the right kinds of things? Are you not elevating the right kinds of things? Are you having exchanges with those in your sphere of influence that are positive, that make a difference? Or are you constantly looking for ways to tear people down? So these are little things that you can do. Practice mindfulness. Again, be present in the moment. But I'm also reminded of, what it kind of takes for different people, right? You and I are both familiar with the disciple Thomas, right? Everyone, and if you aren't familiar with it, you've heard probably the phrase doubting Thomas, right? And I think about that a lot. Here's a person who in the Bible, close to Jesus, purportedly witnessed all these miracles firsthand, right? Closest circle. And yet he still didn't really believe. He didn't fully believe. And when after the resurrection, Jesus comes back and meets with him and says, he says, like, Thomas, I know you still don't even believe that I'm here. So just, take your hand, take your fingers and, literally put them in my side where I was pierced. He had to get his hands on the actual thing to really come to grips with the reality of it. And look, there are people like that. People who are close to this subject who can't seem to let it go for whatever reason. They just hang around and maybe they're kind of annoying sometimes, seriously, you still don't believe, but that's okay. And the moment, I think, will present itself for them to have that experience. And if not with this, I hope with something else that helps them, be grounded, helps them find joy in their life, rather than always looking around for things to tear down and doubt. And then the last thing I want to say, or I turn it back to you, back to the Wizard of Oz, right? Think about that story. All their hopes were trying to get to the Emerald City and talk to the wizard, right? We just wanted to get to the wizard. But the wizard really wasn't what they thought. The point of that entire thing wasn't getting to the wizard. It was the experiences that they had on the road together and they were so fixated on that Emerald City and having that encounter and building it up as this grand, amazing thing that they kind of missed what was right in front of them the entire time. And I think, as many in our circles have said, UFOs are cool, but they're really kind of the least interesting part of the story, right? There's so much more at stake here than the shiny object. And we need to start paying attention to that deeper layer.
Absolutely. And I would say that actually noticing the psychological, sociological reactions in our midst is one of the most telling and interesting aspects of this entire enterprise. So as much as those of us who are intimately familiar with this topic and have long believed that there is a there, to say the least, we can be frustrated when we see people who are doggedly saying, well, I think it's more likely this or that. And those notions that they're putting forward sound ever more outlandish and ever more like conspiracy theories, but they seem to be unable to hear their own voice, unable to even hear how unpersuasive those arguments seem in light of the evidence. And they double down. This is what happens here. And I think some people want to ascribe nefarious intention to these people and say they're definitely being paid by the DOD or somebody. And there are some people like that, don't get me wrong. But I think there are other people who are generally and genuinely faithful actors who are acting in good faith, who just find it impossible to go there. They just find it impossible. Not even necessarily because they're so close-minded as the fact that their sense of being okay with what is determined by their current worldview. They cannot get past the shock that would involve unraveling all of that. And there's such a commitment to this establishment narrative. It's so strong in them that they don't recognize that they are holding as closely to the current myth of modern reductionistic science as the Catholic Church was and the faithful in the Middle Ages, and how they had to wake up from that. So we have another kind of renaissance kind of on cue here. That's what's really going on here. I think that we need to think about not just the people like in this article, the father who was left alone, abandoned to die alone with that understanding of what was going on. Or in my case, I didn't follow up with the 747 pilot that I'm sure felt very, very strange that no one asked him a single question. How alone must he have felt, right? So I have to reckon with that. But in the same way, we are all human beings here. And rather than turning into sides, you're the debunker, you're the skeptic. Look, I get it. It's no fun when people's lives are impacted. And some people's lives have been literally destroyed by the long-term scoff and disinformation campaign that's been run by the government to keep the secret. So I'm not trying to question the scope here and the seriousness of what's happened. But at some point, we have to find a way to move forward together, right? We have to model what it means to move forward. Some people will be falling apart at the seams because they will at some point have to reckon with the fact that they've been wrong all along and they've been doggedly wrong. They're on the wrong side of history. And that's not a fun place to be. So as much as we can right now become myopic and say, I can't wait till we get there so they finally, get their comeuppance kind of thing. But we will get there. We're not that far away even. So recognize they will then have to have that internal dialogue with themselves. So that's kind of what we need to think about, where things are going and how can we prep ourselves to be part of the solution then. So we're always putting ourselves in a position to bring people together, move forward as a family of people rather than based on sides.
Humility, right? Humility. We are all wrong at some point. And as right as we might be about what may be transpiring here, you and I both know reality far expands beyond our understanding and will continue to do so. So no matter what positions we have now that are more efficacious, I work to that end, with the way in which we understand the world, inevitably they will fail other aspects of reality that will emerge. And when you grasp that, when you understand that, you realize that yeah, you're wrong now too. We're all wrong in some ways. So let's be humble and be generous, be charitable with one another. It's great to be having this conversation with you. I can't believe where we are in this moment, having this chat. It's really, really quite incredible, and a journey, quite a journey it's been so far, just on the show and with our listeners. We thank all of our listeners for the support that we receive. Your likes, your subscribes, your shares, all those make a big difference in helping us to have this conversation with a wider audience and encourage similar conversations to take place. And that's really, I think, the work that we want to see happening is that, folks who've been a part of the show, kind of take some of these things and have these conversations wherever they find themselves. So thank you, listeners, for your time and your efforts in that regard. And on that note, may the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Frames.